Hello, welcome to your Quiz 2 review video. Okay, so we're going to start off with a couple problems and we're just going to find all of our solutions. So that means once we factor, we're going to have to solve for our x and get our solutions. So looking at this first problem, we have x to the fourth plus x cubed minus x minus 1 equals 0. So since we have 4 terms, that means our mind should automatically go to grouping. Okay, since we have 4 terms, we need to factor out the GCF of the first 2 and then the second 2. So our GCF is x cubed, so that would leave us with an x plus 1 on the inside. And our GCF for this one would be a negative 1. That would leave us with an x plus 1 on the inside, and that equals 0. So if we're looking, we have the same thing on the inside for both, and that is what we want. So that means we can take our x cubed and our negative 1 and put that together in one factor, and then have our x plus 1 in the other factor, so that equals to 0. So then from here we need to say, okay, can I factor this anymore? Looking at our x plus 1, we can't factor that anymore. But this x cubed minus 1, that is a difference of cubes. So our a value, here's x, our b value is a 1. So that would give us a x minus 1, same sign, and then a squared, opposite sign. And then this one is AB, so that's just x. And then last one's always positive for b squared, which is just 1, our SOAP. And then we still have our x plus 1 from before, so that equals to 0. So now it looks like we are simplified enough. We factored as much as we could. So then we can set each of our factors equal to 0 using our ZPP. So our x minus 1 equal to 0, our x squared plus x plus 1 equal to 0, and our x plus 1 equal to 0. So our first and our last ones are easy. That just gives us an answer of x equals 1 and x equals negative 1. But this middle term here, since we have a quadratic, we're going to have to either use our quadratic formula or, if you remember way back, we could use completing the square. I'm just going to use our quadratic formula, so that's the opposite of b, plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c, all over 2a. Remember, a, b, and c are just our coefficients here. So that simplifies to negative 1 plus or minus the square root. This is 1 minus 4, so it's negative 3 under a square root, all over 2. So then that will simplify to negative 1 plus or minus I root 3, stop it, 3 over 2. Okay, we took our I out because we have a negative under the square root, so that gives us our, not what I meant to do. That's weird. That was weird, but we should end up with 4 solutions because our degree is 4. We have 1, 2, and then with our plus or minus, we have 4. So we are good. We have all of our solutions. Now, let's look at number 2. We have a 4x to the fourth minus 5x squared minus 9. Now, this is our quadratic form. It has, instead of having an x squared and an x, we have an x to the fourth and an x squared. So, if we're looking at this, we would factor like we normally would, but we have an a value of 4. So that means we're going to have to use our Batman method. So, what 2 numbers multiply to be negative 36 and add to be negative 5. Let's bring down our 4x to the fourth and our negative 9 here. So, if you think about that for a second, you should get negative 9x squared and a positive 4x squared. Okay, and as always, you could have switched this, your negative 9x and your positive 4x squared, and that would have been okay too. So then from here, we need a factor by grouping. So we group together the first two and the last two. Take out our GCF. So that out of the first one, it's just x squared. So we're left with 4x squared minus 9. And then out of the second one, we can just take out a positive 1. So that's a 4x squared minus 9. And look, we have the same thing in both, and that's what we want. So our x squared and our 1 go on the outside, or go together in a factor. And then we have our 4x squared minus 9 in another factor. We set that equal to 0. So then from here we need to say, well, can I simplify this even more? So you should notice that this factor here is a difference of 2 squares. So that is going to simplify to 2x plus 3 and 2x minus 3. The 2x comes from the square root of our a value here, and the 3 comes from the square root of the b value. And that will be equal to 0. And don't forget, we have our x squared plus 1 on the outside. We can't do anything with that. So from here, we set each of our factors equal to 0. When we solve, we subtract the 1 over, so we have x squared equals negative 1. Take the square root of both sides. We have x squared equals, we have x equals square root of negative 1. That's just plus or minus I. And when you solve this, subtract over your 3, so you have 2x equals negative 3. That leaves you with x equals negative 3 halves. And this one over here, that just leaves you with x equals 3 halves. Okay, so we have our answers, and just to double check as always, our degree is 4, so we should end up with 4 answers. 1, 2, 3, 4. We're good to go. Okay, so let's scroll down, or for you, flip the page over, and look at this last problem here. It is x cubed minus 6x squared plus 21x minus 26. So just like before, we have 4 terms. Let's see if we can factor by grouping. So take out the GCF. So we'll have x squared, that's our GCF for our first one. That's x, we'll end up with x minus 6. And GCF out of this one, that's just a positive 1. So it's 21x minus 26 equals 0. We have a problem. These two factors do not add up. So that means we cannot factor by grouping. So if you remember, if we can't factor by grouping with a 4-termed polynomial, we should automatically think we have to use synthetic division. Our best friends. Okay, so what I need you to do, since it didn't give us a 0, is go in your calculator, plug this in, and find your 0, or your solution, or your x-intercept, all the same thing, and use that to use synthetic division. Okay, so pause, graph this on your calculator, and find a 0 to use synthetic division, and do synthetic division, and then we'll check after that. Alright, so from your calculator, you should have had your answer of 2. So using that to use synthetic division, you should have ended up with x squared minus 4x plus 13. So from here, we need to say, okay, can I factor this? Can I simplify this anymore? So looking at that, it is not factorable. If it was, that would make our lives a little bit easier, but it's not, which is not a big deal. So let's write this all out in factored form like we always do. So we can set it equal to 0 and solve for our zeros. So factored form, don't forget your f of x equals, we have our x squared minus 4x plus 13, but we have one more factor. We have this 0 here can't forget that. If we have this 0, that means it gives us a factor of x minus 2. Okay, so this is our answer in factored form, but we want to find our zeros. So we set this equal to 0. We have x squared minus 4x plus 13, and have x minus 2. Now, our x minus 2, that's an easy one. That just gives us an answer of x equals 2. We already knew that from our calculator. For this, we're going to have to use, because this is a quadratic, we could use quadratic formula or completing the square. I'm going to use quadratic formula, so that's the opposite of b. So it's 4 plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. Okay, so it leaves us with 4 plus or minus. When you simplify what's underneath the square root, you end up getting negative 36 all over 2. So this simplifies to 4 plus or minus 6i over 2. But if you're looking at it's dividing by 2, we have 2 even numbers here. We can simplify this even further. So that gives us an answer. Divide 4 by 2, you get 2. You start with plus or minus. 6i divided by 2 is 3i. So that gives us 2 answers here, 1 answer here. So 3 answers. We started out with the cubic, so we're good. We have all of our answers. Okay, so this is just a little factoring guide for you as you go to study for your quiz even more. If we only have 2 terms, that means we're going to have to either use the difference of 2 squares, the sum of cubes, or the difference. Not differences. Difference of cubes. Okay, and the first thing though, if we have 2 terms is, well, for any of these, is we need to check if we can factor out a GCF first. That will save us a whole lot of time. Okay, then for our 3 terms, we could just use our regular factoring. If our a is 1, or we can use, oops, not Batman, factoring, which is when our a does not equal 1. And then we also have our quadratic form. That's when we have an x to the 4th and an x squared. And just as a reminder, these 2 are quadratics. That's just your x squared and your x. And if we wanted to solve, because sometimes it'll have us solve these for our zeros. So when we're solving, we have 2 options. We can complete the square, or we have the option, which is more popular, using the quadratic formula. And for extra points, I want you to write out the quadratic formula right here. Okay, so write out what the quadratic formula is right here, just to make sure you're watching the video. And if we have 4 terms, we can use grouping, otherwise known as the Bruce Wayne method, whichever way you want to call it, or synthetic division. Okay, so we have all of these methods. I hope you can use this table and use this as a study tool for you. You have some bookwork that you can practice on, work on your goal packet, but make sure you study for this quiz, and I will see you in class.